Who is responsible for Taiwan's defense?
Part 59.
U.S. government misstatements on the Taiwan status issue.
Have U.S. government officials ever made misstatements on the Taiwan status issue? In particular, have they made misstatements which would lead interested parties to have a mistaken impression when searching for the answers to the following questions regarding sovereignty? 1. When did Japan lose her territorial sovereignty over Taiwan? 2. When, if ever, was the territorial sovereignty of Taiwan transferred to the Republic of China?
It is not only Chinese researchers who are interested in these questions. American and other Western researchers are also very much interested. A good starting point for an investigation is the Foreign Relations of the United States series, published by the U.S. Department of State, DOS, and available online.
One famous account concerning these issues was recorded in the spring of 1946.
In a FRUS entry from March 26, 1946 entitled, JCS 1651, Sovereignty Status of Formosa, it is written that, it would appear that Japan has lost sovereignty over Formosa.
This is a surprising conclusion, considering that the post-war treaty has not yet been drafted.
A more correct perspective, from the standpoint of international law, would clarify that Japan's sovereignty over Taiwan will end according to the specifications of the peace treaty. The surrender ceremonies in Taipei of October 25, 1945, only marked the beginning of the military occupation. There was no transfer of sovereignty at that time. Therefore, in the opinion of the compilers of the current series of films, the analysis in JCS 1651 is incorrect.
Why would the Office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff make a misstatement on this important issue?
January 1950 pronouncements.
Surprisingly, some 4 years later, it seems that President Truman's advisors had still not recognized the truth regarding these Taiwan sovereignty questions.
Let's review President Harry Truman's remarks in his press conference on the morning of January 5, 1950.
In the joint declaration at Cairo on December 1, 1943, the President of the United States, the British Prime Minister, and the President of China stated that it was their purpose that territories Japan had stolen from China, such as Formosa, should be restored to the Republic of China. The United States was a signatory to the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, 1945, which declared that the terms of the Cairo Declaration should be carried out. The provisions of this declaration were accepted by Japan at the time of its surrender. In keeping with these declarations, Formosa was surrendered to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and for the past 4 years the United States and other allied powers have accepted the exercise of Chinese authority over the island.
U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Acheson gave supplemental remarks in his press conference on the afternoon of January 5.
In the middle of the war, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the President of China agreed at Cairo that among the areas stolen from China by Japan was Formosa, and Formosa should go back to China. As the President pointed out this morning, that statement was incorporated in the declaration at Potsdam, and that declaration at Potsdam was conveyed to the Japanese as one of the terms of their surrender and was accepted by them, and the surrender was made on that basis. Shortly after that, the island of Formosa was turned over to the Chinese in accordance with the declarations made and with the conditions of the surrender. The Chinese have administered Formosa for 4 years. Neither the United States nor any other ally ever questioned that authority and that occupation. When Formosa was made a province of China, nobody raised any lawyers' doubts about that. That was regarded as in accordance with the commitments.
As of early January 1950, both President Truman and Secretary of State, Acheson, appear to agree with the line of thinking that Taiwan's sovereign status was decided at the surrender ceremonies. Mr. Acheson even speaks of Formosa having already been made a province of China.
With this as a background, it was no doubt quite unexpected that President Truman's later statement on June 27, 1950, clarified Taiwan's status as being undetermined. Indeed, this caused considerable consternation in the international community. Many people opined that he was changing his viewpoint on the ROC sovereignty issue.
However, in truth, the content of the press conferences of January 5 contained many errors.
While we would like to think that in the period from mid-January 1950 to mid-June 1950, both President Truman's advisors and Secretary Acheson's advisors would have devoted some time to studying the 1907 Hague Regulations and the 1940 U.S. War Department, Field Manual FM 2710, Rules of Land Warfare. But sadly that was probably not the case.
It is quite unfortunate that the press conferences of January 5, 1950, and June 27, 1950, make no mention of the fundamental facts that
A. The ROC's presence in Taiwan is a military occupation. B. International law specifies that military occupation does not transfer sovereignty. C. The territorial sovereignty of Taiwan is still held by Japan. D. There is no doctrine of restored territory under international law. E. Therefore there was no Taiwan Retrocession Day on October 25, 1945, etc.
More seriously, neither the President nor the Secretary of State have clarified that certain types of activities are prohibited in occupied territory. If we are concerned about the human rights of the Taiwan people, the clarification of these fundamental laws of war principles is certainly an issue that cannot be overlooked.
More broadly speaking, in addition to content of these 1950 press conferences, if we examine the entirety of the speeches and writings of President Truman and Secretary Acheson during their times in office, we find no mention of the fact that following actions by the ROC regime in occupied Taiwan territory are illegal.
1. The January 1946 military order authorizing mass naturalization of Taiwan people as ROC citizens. 2. The trials of civilians in military courts. 3. The promulgation of new criminal code, constitution, and legal structure. 4. Seizure, expropriation, and confiscation of Japanese property. 5. The implementation of mandatory military conscription policies over the local populace, etc.
And of course, this conveniently brings us back to the primary focus of this series of films. Who is responsible for Taiwan's defense?
1961 and 1971 Memoranda.
Speaking of laws of war principles, the lack of attention to these principles is very much evident in the two memoranda issued by the Department of State regarding the legal status of Taiwan.
Although the content of these memoranda do support the premise that Taiwan's legal status is undetermined, nevertheless there is no discussion that under the laws of war such a legal status corresponds to saying that the territory has not attained a final legal, political disposition.
In more technical language, we can describe Taiwan territory by saying that it is in interim status under the laws of occupation.
Unfortunately, these memoranda do not go into any detailed discussion of Taiwan's status as occupied territory, and certainly don't mention the many types of activities which are prohibited in occupied territory.
Under such circumstances, it is perhaps not surprising that extensive analysis of the many violations of these international norms, which the Chiang Kai-shek regime perpetrated in occupied Taiwan, were not discussed. Hence, these 1961 and 1971 memoranda have not fulfilled their goal of giving all interested parties a complete understanding of Taiwan's legal position.
In summary, the charge can certainly be made that beginning in the 1940s, much of the information, pronouncements, memoranda, descriptions, etc. regarding Taiwan and the ROC sovereignty issue promulgated by U.S. government officials is inaccurate, incomplete, and oftentimes misleading.